In the mountain town of Silver Hollow, Colorado, everyone knew the abandoned copper shaft on the North Ridge, and everyone knew the boy who had chosen to live inside it. His name was Caleb Mercer, 13 years old, thin as a fence rail, eyes too steady for someone his age. He walked like someone who had already measured the world and found it unreliable. Most mornings, Caleb came down from the ridge before sunrise. Frost clung to the scrub pine. His boots were patched with leather cut from an old saddle. In one hand, he carried 2 tin canteens for water. In the other, a canvas sack stitched from flour bags. The sack was for what he could afford at Dawson's Mercantile, usually dried beans, sometimes cracked corn. If Mr. Dawson was in a charitable mood, a bruised apple or a heel of yesterday's bread. People noticed him, they always noticed him, they just didn't speak to him. "He's living like a badger," someone would mutter from a porch. "Won't last till January," another would say. "Mountain'll swallow him." Caleb heard enough to understand the tone. He did not argue, he did not explain. The mine entrance was framed with old timber beams gone grey with age. Caleb had reinforced it with scavenged boards and hung a thick door made from mismatched planks, bolted together with iron straps he'd found near the old rail spur. Inside, the shaft sloped inward at a shallow angle before bending sharply to the left. Caleb had claimed the space just past that bend. It was not deep enough to feel dangerous, but it was deep enough to feel different. A year earlier, he had lived in a narrow boarding room behind the livery stable with his mother. She washed clothes, he chopped wood. Then fever came through Silver Hollow like smoke through a cracked window. It took her in 4 days. The landlord waited 2 weeks before asking for rent. When Caleb couldn't pay, he was told gently that sympathy did not cover expenses. He left with a blanket, a dented pot, and his mother's sewing kit. Most boys would have tried to leave town. Caleb climbed upward instead. Because his mother had once told him something she'd heard from an old miner who drank coffee at their table in the evenings. "The mountain don't change," the miner had said, tapping ash into a chipped saucer. "Dig deep enough and it stays the same all year. Cold don't bite as hard. Heat don't press as heavy. Earth remembers how to hold itself steady." Caleb remembered. He cleared loose rock from the bend in the tunnel. He leveled the ground. He built a narrow bed frame from scrap timber and stuffed it with pine needles and old wool batting. He set a small cast-iron stove near the wall. Its flue vented carefully through a natural crack in the rock that rose toward the surface. He did not burn it hot, just steady. The stone walls absorbed the warmth and held it. When snow began to dust the ridge in October, Caleb noticed something important. The air inside the mine barely shifted, not warm, not cold, just stable. He tested it. He left a cup of water near the entrance and another further in, beside his sleeping space. By morning, the cup near the entrance wore a skin of ice. The one near his bed did not. He carried his food deeper after that. Past his living space, the shaft widened into an old equipment chamber. Rusted rails still ran along the floor. Wooden supports arched overhead. The air there felt different, dry, still. Caleb pressed his palm against the rock and felt the faint, cool steadiness of it. He began building shelves, not sloppy stacks, not piles. Shelves measured carefully, boards balanced on stone brackets, crates labeled in pencil, beans on the left, corn on the right, potatoes centered where airflow felt strongest. He kept a small notebook, pages salvaged from an old ledger, where he wrote everything down. How much he ate, how much remained, how long it should last. He wasn't guessing, he was calculating. At school, the laughter followed him. "Mine rat! Careful you don't cave in on yourself." He did not swing back. He did not shout. He understood something the others did not. Survival was quieter than pride. By November, Silver Hollow had begun its usual ritual. Men patched roofs too late. Women filled root cellars that always grew damp by January. Woodpiles stacked hastily. fireplaces cleaned half-heartedly. They had survived winters before, they assumed they would again. But the air felt wrong. Old-timers said it. The sky sat too high and too pale. Cold moved in without wind. Animals grew restless before dusk. Caleb stood outside his mine one evening and watched a line of clouds building over the western peaks. He whispered into his collar, "It's coming early." He reinforced his door, added another layer of canvas between plank and stone, checked the flue channel twice, moved more food into the deeper chamber. He did not know exactly what was coming, but he knew this: the mountain would not panic, and neither would he. If you believe sometimes the thing people mock becomes the thing that saves them, leave a comment and tell us where you're watching from. Because what happened next changed the way Silver Hollow looked at that mine forever. By the first week of December, Silver Hollow wore its usual winter mask. Snow lined the boardwalks in uneven ridges. Chimneys smoked from dawn until well after dark. The blacksmith's anvil rang sharper in the cold air, each strike brittle and metallic. People said the town was ready. They always said that. Caleb watched from the ridge and said nothing. He had begun measuring temperature the only way he could, by observation and pattern. He left small pieces of lard in two places, one near the mine entrance, one in the deeper storage chamber. The outer piece stiffened into something close to stone by morning. The inner one remained pliable. He kept notes. He moved his sleeping space 6 feet deeper. He stacked additional boards along the entrance corridor to create a narrow, offset passage, so wind could not travel straight in if the door shifted under pressure. He reinforced the door hinges with salvaged iron brackets from an abandoned ore cart. He sealed cracks with a mixture of clay and ash. At Dawson's Mercantile, talk grew louder. "They're saying Alberta's already 20 below. Wind's coming hard this year. Barometer dropped like a stone." Caleb stood quietly near the flour barrel, listening without appearing to listen. Mr. Dawson leaned over the counter. "You still up in that hole, son?" "Yes, sir." "You got enough wood?" "I don't need much." Dawson frowned. "You burn in that stove constant?" "Not constant." The older man shook his head. "Mountain'll freeze you from the inside if you ain't careful." Caleb nodded politely. He did not try to explain that the deeper chamber had not dipped below 45 degrees since October. He had measured it with an old thermometer his mother once used for canning jars. He had hung it from a nail in the stone. Outside, 12 degrees. Inside, 48, without fire. He only burned the stove in short, steady cycles, just enough to warm the rock near his living space, which would then radiate back slowly over hours. He was learning to use the mountain's mass instead of fighting it. On December 18th, the wind began to shift. Not stronger, quieter. That worried him more. Snow fell lightly for 2 days, then stopped. The sky cleared to an unnatural blue. Cold thickened. By Christmas Eve, Silver Hollow dropped to 15 below. Whitaker's root cellar froze solid despite being half buried. The Johnson family lost 2 chickens to exposure. Caleb noticed something else. His deeper storage chamber remained steady, 46 degrees. Apples firm, potatoes unblemished. He added one more shelf and one more layer of straw insulation beneath his bed. On January 2nd, the storm announced itself. Not with snow, with silence. The kind of silence that presses against your ears. By afternoon, the sky turned metallic grey. The wind came from the north, hard, relentless. By sundown, the temperature had fallen 30 degrees in 4 hours. Men ran across streets with scarves wrapped tight. Doors slammed. Barn latches were double-checked. Caleb stood inside his mine and listened. Wind struck the outer door like a steady drum, but beyond the first bend in the tunnel, it faded into a low, distant moan. He checked the ventilation fissure overhead. Air still flowed, not too fast, not stagnant. He closed the interior plank barrier and secured it with rope. He banked a small fire in the stove for exactly 90 minutes, then let it die down. The stone walls began to give back what they had taken. Warmth radiated gently into the air. By midnight, the temperature outside had reached 30 below. The wind increased. Snow no longer fell downward. It moved sideways. Silver Hollow disappeared under white sheets of force. At dawn, a section of the livery stable roof tore loose. The schoolhouse chimney cracked. The mercantile's front window frosted over from the inside. Inside the mine, Caleb woke under 3 blankets. He could see his breath faintly, but it was thin, not desperate. He checked the thermometer, 42 degrees. He did not relight the stove. He did not waste wood. The mountain was holding. By the second night, the storm intensified, 40 below. Wind screaming hard enough to drive snow through seams in houses never meant for that kind of pressure. Doors iced shut, chimneys backdrafted, firewood burned faster than expected. The Johnson family's cellar flooded with melt and refroze, food ruined. At the mine entrance, snow piled high, pressing against the door. Caleb felt the pressure when he leaned against it, but the offset corridor prevented direct force from reaching his living space. Wind lost its shape in the turn. He moved deeper that night, carried his blankets into the storage chamber, set up a temporary sleeping area between shelves of potatoes and beans. The temperature there read 45 degrees. Outside, 43 below, a difference of nearly 90 degrees. He slept without lighting the stove at all. On the third day, Silver Hollow began to fail. Whitaker's youngest boy developed frostbite on 2 fingers after fetching water. The livery lost its only draft horse. The blacksmith's wife collapsed from exhaustion after keeping their stove burning non-stop for 36 hours. Firewood supplies shrank fast. Men could not safely cut more. Wind made it impossible. By afternoon, someone noticed smoke rising from the mine's fissure. Thin, steady, controlled. "Kid's still alive up there," someone muttered. "Won't be long," another said. But curiosity turned into concern when word spread that Caleb had not come down for water in 3 days. Sheriff Holden and 2 others climbed the ridge late that afternoon, leaning into wind that nearly knocked them sideways. They reached the mine door and found it buried halfway in drift. Holden pounded once. "Boy!" From inside, a voice answered. "I'm here." The sheriff pushed the door inward with difficulty. Warm air, mild, dry, flowed out. Not hot, not smoky, steady. Holden stepped through the offset passage and into the first chamber. His beard glittered with ice. He stopped. The temperature difference hit him like stepping into a cellar in summer. "Good Lord," he breathed. Caleb stood near his stove, calm. "You're warm," Holden said. "Yes, sir." "How?" Caleb hesitated, then answered simply, "The mountain holds it." The sheriff stepped deeper, following Caleb into the storage chamber. He stared at the thermometer. 44 degrees. No roaring fire, no massive woodpile, just shelves, organized, measured, stable. Holden looked at the boy differently then. "Town's running short," he said carefully. "Cellars froze, wood's going fast." Caleb swallowed. His chest tightened. The thought he'd been holding quietly for weeks surfaced again. What if others needed this space? He looked around at the steady rock, at the shelves, at the stable air. "I've got room," he said. Holden studied him. "You'd let folks in?" Caleb nodded once. "Yes, sir." Outside, wind continued its assault, but inside the mountain, something stronger had taken shape. Not just shelter, a solution. And before the storm finished carving its lesson into Silver Hollow, that mine would become more than a boy's refuge. It would become the only place in town where cold could not win. Sheriff Holden did not waste time. By nightfall, word had spread through Silver Hollow that the boy's mine was warmer than any stove in town. At first, people argued, "It's just a fluke. Rock sweats, it'll turn damp. He's exaggerating." But when Whitaker's cellar froze solid and Mrs. Doherty's stovepipe cracked from rapid cooling, pride lost its grip. Holden returned to the mine with 3 families before sunrise the next morning. The climb up the ridge was brutal. Wind still cut across the slope in violent bursts, and drifts reached waist-high in places. Children were wrapped in quilts and carried. One elderly man leaned heavily on a shovel handle as if it were a cane. Caleb stood inside the offset corridor, holding the door steady as each person ducked through. The transition startled them. Outside, wind clawed at lungs. Inside, air rested calmly against skin, not hot, not smoky, just steady. The Johnson family lost 2 chickens to exposure. Caleb noticed something else. His deeper storage chamber remained steady, 46 degrees, apples firm, potatoes unblemished. He added 1 more shelf, and 1 more layer of straw insulation beneath his bed. On January 2nd, the storm announced itself, not with snow, with silence, the kind of silence that presses against your ears. By afternoon, the sky turned metallic grey. The wind came from the north, hard, relentless. By sundown, the temperature had fallen 30 degrees in 4 hours. Men ran across streets with scarves wrapped tight. Mrs. Whitaker pressed her palm against the stone wall. "It's warm," she whispered. "It stays," Caleb said quietly. He had spent the night rearranging. Shelves were shifted deeper, potatoes stacked tighter. The open floor space in the staging chamber cleared. He had moved his bed again, this time closer to the rock wall, where temperature held most constant. "Keep close to the walls," he instructed, his voice steady in a way that did not match his age. The air moves slower there. Sheriff Holden noticed the change. The boy was not frightened, he was organized. Families settled into the chamber carefully, blankets spread, children huddled. The mine, once quiet and solitary, filled with the low murmur of breath and shifting boots. Caleb checked the thermometer, 43 degrees. He calculated quickly. Each adult body generated roughly as much heat as a small lantern, each child slightly less. The chamber was about 25 feet deep and 15 wide. Stone mass surrounding them weighed thousands of tons. It would absorb their heat during the day and return it slowly at night, if they did not light too many fires. "Only 1 stove," Caleb said firmly when Mr. Doherty reached for a match. "Smoke will build." "But it's freezing out there," Doherty protested. "It's not freezing in here," Caleb replied. The room quieted. The boy was right. They did not need roaring flames. They needed moderation. Holden placed a hand on Caleb's shoulder. "Listen to him," the sheriff said. "He's been living here longer than we have." The first full day passed cautiously. Caleb assigned small tasks. Move snow from the entrance tunnel, but leave a drift against the outer door for insulation. Keep the ventilation fissure clear of ice buildup. Rotate people closer to the back chamber at night, where temperatures held highest. He did not bark orders, he suggested them, and they made sense. By evening, outside temperatures dropped again, 45 below. Wind still screamed. In town, roofs sagged. 1 shed collapsed entirely. But inside the mine, the temperature held at 42. Bodies and rock worked together. Caleb relit the stove for 1 hour at dusk, just enough to charge the surrounding stone, then let it die. Mrs. Doherty watched him carefully. "You measure it," she said quietly. "Yes, ma'am. You don't guess." "No, ma'am." She nodded slowly. Her husband, who had once called the mine foolish, now sat wrapped in a borrowed blanket, 3 feet from shelves of preserved beans that had not frozen. On the second night, something shifted. More people climbed the ridge. Some came reluctantly, some desperate. Whitaker's remaining livestock had frozen in their stalls, despite constant feeding of the stove. Coleman's youngest daughter had developed a cough that worsened in the cold air of their drafty house. By midnight, nearly 20 townsfolk huddled inside the staging chamber. The mine felt different now, Not crowded, but alive. Caleb adjusted. He opened a small secondary passage near the entrance for airflow balance. He instructed 2 men to create a barrier of stacked crates halfway down the corridor to slow air exchange without blocking it. The mountain breathed, slowly, predictably, and it kept breathing. On the 3rd day of the storm, something remarkable happened. The thermometer read 41 degrees, even with outside temperatures nearing 50 below. The presence of bodies had stabilized the interior. Stone absorbed what they gave it, and returned it. Mrs. Whitaker began helping Caleb inventory supplies. Potatoes divided carefully, flour rationed precisely, beans soaked in water drawn from the deeper well of the mine where ice had never formed. Mr. Doherty, who once scoffed at the mole boy, reinforced shelves without being asked. Sheriff Holden organized sleeping rotations. The mine became structured, disciplined, functional. Children stopped shivering. They played quiet games in the corner near the back wall where warmth felt strongest. One little girl pressed her cheek to the stone and giggled. "It feels like summer," she said. Caleb smiled faintly. The mountain did not feel like summer. It felt like consistency, like something that did not panic. Above them, Silver Hollow suffered. 2 chimneys collapsed under pressure. Firewood piles shrank to splinters. Men who had insisted they would weather the storm alone now trudged through drifts toward the ridge. By the 4th day, nearly 30 people occupied the mine. Caleb stood near the entrance tunnel and felt the outer door shudder under wind. He checked hinges, still firm. He checked ventilation, still steady. He checked the thermometer, 40 degrees. It had only dropped 3 degrees since the storm's peak. He felt something unfamiliar then, not pride, responsibility. This space no longer belonged to him alone. It belonged to everyone inside it. That evening, Sheriff Holden addressed the group. "We owe this boy our lives," he said plainly. Murmurs of agreement filled the chamber. Caleb looked down at his hands. He remembered the laughter. Mole boy. Living like a ghost. The words felt distant now, because ghosts did not build systems, ghosts did not plan, and they did not measure temperature shifts against stone mass and human presence. On the 5th day, the wind began to weaken. Snow still fell, but vertically now. Temperature rose slightly, to 35 below. For Silver Hollow, that felt like mercy. Inside the mine, warmth remained stable, food remained unfrozen, people remained alive. Mrs. Doherty approached Caleb quietly. "You could have stayed alone," she said. "Yes, ma'am." "You didn't." He hesitated. "My granddad said the mountain protects what you put inside it." She nodded slowly. "You put us inside it." By the time the storm finally loosened its grip on the 6th day, Silver Hollow looked like a town carved from ice. Drifts reached rooftops, sheds lay crushed, windows cracked. But no one from the mine had suffered frostbite, no one had starved, no one had frozen. When the first clear sunrise pierced through lingering clouds, light filtered down the tunnel and touched the stone walls in pale gold. The air inside the chamber remained steady, 41 degrees. Caleb stood near the entrance and opened the door carefully. Cold air rushed in, sharp and violent. The contrast felt almost shocking. He stepped outside onto the drifted ridge. Below him, the town lay buried but intact. Behind him, 30 townsfolk stirred within a mountain that had kept its promise. They had laughed, they had whispered, they had doubted. Now they stood, because of the boy who trusted rock more than pride. And the lesson was only beginning to settle. When the sky finally cleared over Silver Hollow, it did not feel like victory. It felt like aftermath. The sun rose pale and thin, casting long blue shadows over drifts that swallowed fences, wagons, and half the lower windows of Main Street. Snow lay hardened into ridges by 6 days of wind, sculpted into cruel shapes that made familiar buildings look foreign. Caleb stepped out of the mine entrance and let the cold air strike his face. It was still below zero, but compared to what had come before, it felt almost gentle. Behind him, the townspeople began emerging in careful groups. They moved slowly at first, as if stepping out of a church after a long vigil. Sheriff Holden stood beside Caleb, scanning the valley. "We'll dig out in teams," he said. "No one goes alone." No one argued. They had learned something inside that mountain. Pride was quieter now. The first day back in town was work. Hard, deliberate, necessary work. Men dug doors free. Women cleared stovepipes. Older children hauled frozen livestock carcasses to a common pit beyond the ridge. The damage revealed itself gradually. Whitaker had lost his remaining sheep. The Doherty's back porch had collapsed entirely. 2 smaller sheds near the schoolhouse had caved in under driftweight. But the worst outcome, the one that would have defined the storm, had not happened. No graves were dug, no black-draped doors. Because of a mine, because of a boy. By afternoon, word had already begun to shift. No one called him Mole Boy anymore. They said his name, Caleb Mercer, and they said it carefully. That evening, as families returned temporarily to damaged homes, Sheriff Holden asked Caleb to walk with him to the general store. Mr. Holloway stood behind the counter, hat in hand. He did not speak at first. He simply looked at the boy. Then he nodded once. "You were right," he said quietly. Caleb did not respond with triumph. He only nodded back. Holloway cleared his throat. "Folks are going to need proper storage, not just this year, every year." Caleb's eyes shifted slightly. "You can't fight the cold," he said. "You have to let the ground handle it." Holden glanced at him. "You think the mine could be permanent?" Caleb hesitated. "It already is." By the second week after the storm, the idea had grown beyond emergency shelter. Whitaker suggested reinforcing the mine's entrance with proper timbers. Steiner, who had once criticized the concept, offered to help build additional offset walls for airflow control. Mrs. Doherty organized preserved goods into a communal reserve stored in the stable chamber. What began as a boy's survival plan turned into infrastructure. Caleb did not command, he demonstrated. He showed them where frost line ended inside the rock, where condensation did not form, where air moved gently through the fissure that acted as natural ventilation. He explained thermal mass in simple language. "Stone doesn't get scared," he said once. "It just stays." The phrase traveled through town like a proverb. Stone doesn't get scared. Silver Hollow began adapting. Within a month, 2 families dug partial earth-bermed root storage rooms behind their homes. Another began carving into a hillside south of town, consulting Caleb quietly about orientation. The laughter that once followed him up the ridge disappeared entirely. In its place came questions, careful ones, respectful ones. Spring thaw arrived late that year. Snow lingered stubbornly in shaded areas, but the valley eventually softened. Meltwater filled ditches and washed clean the scars of wind. Caleb continued living in the mine. He could have asked for a room in town. Someone would have offered. But he chose the mountain, because it had kept its promise. One afternoon in late April, Mrs. Whitaker climbed the ridge, carrying a small bundle wrapped in cloth. She found Caleb near the entrance, reinforcing the outer door hinge. "This is for you," she said. Inside the cloth were gloves, new, thick wool lined with leather at the palms. Caleb turned them over slowly. "You didn't have to." "We did," she interrupted gently. He looked at her, unsure what to say. "You kept my grandchildren from freezing," she continued. "That's not something we forget." That night, alone in the steady quiet of the staging chamber, Caleb ran his hand across the stone wall. The temperature had shifted slightly with the season, cooler now than outside air. He smiled faintly. The mountain did not change. It balanced, and Silver Hollow had learned to balance with it. By summer, the mine had become more than refuge. It became storage, then a meeting place, then a kind of insurance. When traders passed through town, they marveled at the coolness inside the rock during July heat. Butter stored in crocks remained firm. Apples lasted weeks longer than expected. Mr. Holloway began using the chamber to store surplus goods rather than risking spoilage in town sheds. In late August, Sheriff Holden addressed the town formally. "We're not closing the mine," he said plainly. "We're improving it." And so they did. Timbers replaced the old entrance beams. A reinforced double-door system was installed to preserve airflow balance. Stone steps were carved carefully into the slope for safer access, and at Caleb's insistence, the ventilation fissure was left untouched. "You don't fix what already works," he said. The phrase stayed. Autumn approached again. Clouds gathered earlier than usual, but this time Silver Hollow did not shrug. They stored deliberately, they measured supplies, they rotated preserved goods through the mine chamber weekly. Children no longer mocked Caleb. Some followed him quietly, asking questions about airflow and temperature. He showed them how to test frost line with shallow pits, how to measure humidity by observing stone condensation, how to store root vegetables without stacking too tightly. He was still small for his age, still quiet, but his voice carried weight now. When the first snow fell the following October, it did not bring fear, it brought preparation. The town had built 3 additional earth-sheltered storage rooms inspired by the mine. Homes had reinforced doors and sealed cracks more carefully. Firewood was stacked but not relied upon exclusively, because they understood something now. Heat was not only about flame, it was about mass, about insulation, about humility in the face of physics. On the anniversary of the storm, Sheriff Holden climbed the ridge again. Caleb was inside, adjusting shelving for winter rotation. Holden stood in the chamber, hat in hand. "We've been talking," he said. Caleb looked up. "The mine belongs to you," Holden continued, "but it belongs to us too, in a way." Caleb nodded slowly. "I don't mind," he said. Holden hesitated. "Folks want to name it, not just the old silver shaft." Caleb blinked. "What for?" "Because it's not that anymore." Silence hung between them. Finally, Holden spoke. "Mercer Hold." Caleb's chest tightened slightly. He looked around at the shelves, the stone walls, the steady air. "It's just rock," he said quietly. Holden smiled. "No," he said. "It's what you understood about it." That winter, another storm came, not as brutal, but strong enough to test memory. Silver Hollow did not panic. Families rotated into Mercer Hold as needed. Storage remained steady. No one froze. No one starved. And when wind battered rooftops, people remembered the boy who trusted the mountain when no one else did. If you believe wisdom sometimes hides in the quietest places and in the youngest voices, leave a comment below and share where you're watching from. Stories like this remind us that resilience is rarely loud at first, but it echoes when it matters most. High above Silver Hollow, the mine entrance stood firm against the ridge. Inside, stone held its temperature. Caleb Mercer sat at his small table, pencil moving steadily across paper. Inventory, rotation, planning. Because he had learned something simple and permanent. The mountain keeps its promise, and so must you. Thank you for watching this video. Click here to watch another video that might interest you.